Coffee with God, of course, Hebrews. Hey, if you aren't having a good conversation on a regular basis with God, then you're probably just going through the motions. And that's what we don't want. We don't want you to go through the motions. We want you to have that conversation with God. So get your 40 together, although this one's going to be a shorty, and hear what God has to say about religion and relationship. It's Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1 to 10. Come on in. Welcome to the Biblical Channel. So glad you're here, and we hope that we are nothing but helpful in helping you engage with God through the Bible that He's given us all. And it is the normal way that God speaks to us is through the Bible that He has given to not only me, but you and the whole world in which we live in. And for the last 2,000 years, He has given this document that has really wrung the chamois of goodness into human society. And I am a massive fan of the Bible, and I hope that you will be too, because in that you find a real engaging relationship with God. Anyhow, we are going to be spending some time in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1 to 10. And here's what it sounds like, although it does really begin with the short statement in 9:11. Hebrews 9:11, 9:11, 9:11. Well, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come. So remember that phrase, because every section that we're looking at is really dependent on that idea that Christ has appeared as high priest and the good things have come. So verse 10:1. For since the law has but a shadow of good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sin? But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sin every year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, He said, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book." Chapter 10, verse 8. When He said above that you neither desire nor take pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings, these are offered according to the law. Then He added, "Behold, I have come to do your will." He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And by that, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Praise be to God for His words. And anytime we read God's words, we ought to pray. And in our prayer, can't imagine coming up with a better one than Jesus did. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we have forgiven our debts. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That prayer never gets old. Anyhow, here we are. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, reminds us that from the biblical perspective, from God's perspective, Jesus Christ has truly inaugurated the good times. Celebrate good times. All of that should be ringing in our ears, because for the last 2,000 years, it really has been Christianity that has wringed the chamois of human goodness out of us and has really changed and altered the framework of society. And even other religions have had to kind of play catch up when it comes to the way that they do business. And so truly, Most scholars have always seen that, the impact of Christianity for the last 2,000 years just cannot be ignored, and it is a positive one. Of course, Christians have done nasty, brutish, silly things in the name of Christianity, but that's not Christianity. You got to go to the source to hear what Christianity is. And that's what people rarely do, is go to the source. The source is the Bible that God has given for us to hear him speak and to start hanging around with each other on and encouraging each other on and getting the best out of our lives. So, the whole person is really what God has in mind. And that's what we're going to find out here. But anyhow, in 10:1, we hear the author say, "For since the law has but a shadow of good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who are drawing near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins? But in these sacrifices, there's a reminder of sins every year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin." Okay, so real simple framework here, but of course the author is still pointing to the good things that Jesus Christ, our high priest, God, has actually brought when he came. And the good times are now upon us. And it's still part of the conversation about how the old sacrificial system of Israel, and if the old sacrificial system of Israel needs revamped or revised or just chucked out the window, then of course anybody else's sacrificial system is going to as well. So that's been kind of the heart of the matter. And this is a hard pill for the ancient world to swallow. It may not be hard for us to swallow. That's because we've been living with Christ now for 2,000 years. Even if you don't believe in Christ, you've been living with Christ for the last 2,000 years. And the benefits of that. So the first point that the author makes here is that the law, including the sacrificial system, it does have its up points. It does have its good things. There's nothing inherently wrong or even problematic with the law that includes the sacrificial system. In fact, it had its good moments. In fact, if you looked at the ancient world around Israel, whenever they were given this sacrificial system and the law, you will find that what God is asking of Israel is to, grow them up and to get them treating their neighbor right and to get them to treat God right and to be thinking about things like forgiveness between you and your neighbor, and forgiveness that God himself is offering. So the idea behind the sacrificial system and the law was a bit of a teaching tool to help Israel to step up in comparison to the other nations around them and to step up in a real relationship with God. And it is a little bit interesting to notice that the author here has used language that meant, if people have studied philosophy, they might hear a little Plato here, because Plato talked a lot about the shadows of life and the good things to come. And I guess it's important to say that Plato wasn't all wrong. Plato believed in God. Plato also believed that the world was in trouble because, well, human beings continued to make trouble in the world. And Plato at least could see that the way the world is was really not in its form that it should be. Now, Plato didn't get it all right, but he did have some elements of right. And I think this idea that the law itself was a shadow of the good things to come, that it wasn't the thing to come, but what has come is the true form of these realities, a point that the author has already made, that Jesus Christ has stepped out of the real things. Jesus Christ has stepped out of the heavenly reality. Jesus Christ has stepped out of the God reality, because that's who he is. And because of this, it changes everything, that there's no priesthood that could ever compare to the priesthood of this high priest, Jesus Christ. And anybody that is calling them a priest is merely a priesthood of believers in Jesus Christ. Otherwise, they're phonies, imposters, things like that. So the sacrificial system was a bit of a shadow. It was pointing towards good things. Jesus himself is the good things. And one of the problems we must, kind of point out about the sacrificial system that the author here is pointing out that was faulty was not faulty from the sake of God. It was faulty from the sake of human beings and what human beings end up doing. And really, the author is just telling us, hey, take a look at Israel, take a look at the sacrificial system, and you will see that the sacrificial system in of itself was nothing, meaning that the only significance in the sacrificial system was the teaching that God had in mind with it. And behind that teaching is God himself, and it's God that is the power. It's not the sacrificial system. The sacrificial system, honestly, just was repetitious, and it was ineffectual. And really, the people of Israel did what people do. They just started showing up and going through the motions. And going through the motions is never what God himself has in mind. Growing, being instructed, and making life improvements in the way that you think about God and other people is exactly what God has in mind. But anytime you have a kind of a ritualistic system in place, it's going to be misunderstood, misused, and abused. And that's exactly what was going on in Israel. People stopped showing up to grow. People stopped showing up to relate to each other. They just showed up to show up for the sake of showing up because it was supposedly the right thing to do. And the next thing you know, people were running around saying, well, this is what God likes, so we just do it. Who cares? Duh. I don't care about it. And so the whole sacrificial system really did not prove to get at the heart of the matter. And that's where the author is, well, honestly, being a little bit sarcastic, because, when the author here, having a little fun, says, otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? Meaning that, hey, if these sacrifices were able to perfect the consciousness, if able to perfect the human being, then, well, of course, the sacrifices would have ended, right? But no, that's not the way it is. In fact, have you ever seen perfect people coming out of the temple? Have you ever seen perfect people coming out of Israel? This is the way he's just being a little bit fun and funny. I think it's funny because he's saying, hey, man, the sacrificial system really wasn't achieving the goal of people growing in their knowledge and understanding of God and relating to their neighbors better, relating to God better. And so it shouldn't surprise us that this sacrificial system needed a huge revision, a huge improvement. And that improvement is in Jesus Christ. There's the point. The sacrificial system, in its best, really was just a reminder of sin. And a reminder of sin is, well, a good thing. It's not bad to remember and be reminded of your sin if you've committed sin. But on the other hand, the idea has to be taken up that the blood of bulls and goats in of themselves are nothing and cannot bring forgiveness. It's God behind the scenes that is offering forgiveness. Even in the Old Testament, it was always God who was offering forgiveness and making the point loud and clear that forgiveness is the most important thing about life as a human sapien here on this planet that we need to digest. We need forgiveness between us and God, and we need forgiveness between us and our neighbors. And so the sacrificial system, frankly, just ended up being a reminder of sin, and people just went through the motions, and consequently were learning nothing, and a bunch of bulls and goats were being sacrificed for no good reason. Perhaps a good barbecue at the end, maybe it was just those priests that were enjoying that, but it really was ineffectual. It really was not, serving a great purpose, achieving its goal. So the idea here, when the author says that it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins is, well, who can take away sin? God. God can do that. Nothing else can do that. Only God can take away sin. Only God can remedy the problem of sin. That is God's realm. That is God's sole realm of power and possibilities. And so if you're showing up at the temple and making sacrifices and you're not there to really find forgiveness and regenerate yourself on this, one giant point of forgiveness being the most important thing that human beings need to wrap our minds around between us and God and us and neighbors, well, then you've just simply lost perspective. And losing perspective is what human beings do. We all know that. We all have some sort of dose of ADD, hard to keep our attention. And when it comes to being reminded of our sin, we develop a real selective hearing disorder, per se. And, it's also worth noting that, there's no doubt that church today and church over the last 2,000 years has quite often failed along the same lines, because, when people start going to church just to go to church, you're back into the same problematic idea that was happening and happened to Israel. So the author here isn't saying that these problems will never go away, but the author is definitely saying that God has a end to the sacrificial system. And in that sacrificial system ending, he brings about one sacrifice for all, once and for all. And that is going to bring, and it does, it actually brings an end to Israel's sacrificial system, but it also brings an end to the world's sacrificial system. I don't think you're going to be able to find a sacrificial system in today's marketplace, even in the non-Christian countries, etc. There has been an effect here. But church today can suffer in the same way. There's no doubt about it. Just simply going to church for going to church's sake, because you think somehow this makes God happy and, you couldn't care less about being there. Well, that's not good either. I had a buddy say to me just a few days ago, he said, "Hey, should I go to church and think about fishing, or should I go fishing and think about God?" And, well, the answer to that is very easy. Well, go fishing and think about God. If going fishing really does make you think lovingly and caringly about God, well, by all means, go fishing. Do whatever it takes to think more lovingly and clearly about God. So I'm all for that. It reminded me of what a friend said to me. I used to ride a lot of motorcycles, and another friend of mine said the same thing. Shouldn't I go motorcycling and think about God rather than going to church and think about motorcycling? So the point is well taken. There's no sense showing up if you in going can't get your mind wrapped around what the essentials are that are going on. And if the church that you keep showing up at is that distracting that you can't think about God, well, by no means should you be there. But sometimes there's just a little bit more going on in our lives when we say things like that. And perhaps that's what we need to focus on too. So church or fishing, yeah, go fishing. But the point here is that church is supposed to be something that is social. It's supposed to be growth oriented, and it's supposed to be supportive. Church is a gathering. The very word church means gathering. It doesn't mean anything other than that. And so the idea of this gathering that we call church is supposed to be a gathering of people who are in the boat that Jesus has made for us. And so we should be showing up to be social. We should be showing up to grow, to hear some good teaching, to encourage one another, to not only be supported, but to actually support, others. It's supposed to be a living, dynamic, good, healthy, relational thing that we do. It's not something meant to be the old ball and chain that drags you down. So if it is the old ball and chain that is dragging you down, then it's time to maybe do an inventory of what's going on. Okay, so the next point that the author makes here is that consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me, and burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book." Now, the author here, seems to be indicating that Christ, when he came into this world, talked a lot about this psalm, which is actually a quote from Psalm 40, verse 6 to 8. So your little homework assignment would definitely be to go back and read the whole of that psalm. Anytime a New Testament author drops in a quote from the Old Testament, you should go back and read the whole passage, not just that little quote. I mean, the little quote's good, but there's a whole lot going on in Psalm 40 that is actually going to get at all of the points here that the author would really like to make. They all come from Psalm 40. We'll get to that at the very end, but he's definitely indicating that Jesus talked a lot about Psalm 40, and this particular portion of Psalm 40, has Jesus saying, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. Now, this comes from King David, who lived 1,000 years before Jesus. So King David was saying this. People in Israel were already saying this. So it seems like there was already an idea here that needed to be communicated, and that is these sacrifices and these offerings are absolutely nothing if you don't know what's going on, and if your mind isn't right, or if the environment is so distracting that you can't think about God. And so this sacrificial system was on the chopping block for a long time. Jesus coming onto the world stage makes it clear that the old sacrificial system is on the chopping block. We ain't doing this anymore. It is definitely ineffectual. It is definitely not achieving its goal. And it was only set up to be a teaching tool that, was meant to accommodate the world that, had sacrificial systems. Israel's sacrificial system, once again, it was good. It had good things going for it compared to the rest of the world's sacrificial systems, which were zany, nutty, wild, off the hook, debaucherous, all kinds of things. Israel's sacrificial system was straight up. It was easy to figure out. It was about forgiveness. And so David knew in this psalm, and Israel knew, at least a portion of Israel knew, that God was always after the whole person, not just, some silly ritual or some silly sacrificial system. The sacrificial system was a teaching tool. It was a means to help an understanding come through. And that understanding that needed to come through from God to us is all about forgiveness. And so verse 7 is really the key to the action. Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. It's a picture of a positive attitude with God. It's a picture of a positive attitude and a positive relationship with God, showing up and saying, hey, man, I'm here to do your will. I'm here, God, to do your will in a very positive and relational kind of way. It's a good attitude. It's the power of positive thinking. This is what God has always been after, is our way of thinking, including God positively in our framework at every twist and every turn. This is what we're supposed to take away. And this is what God is always going to be after. And so that brings the author to the conclusion here, which is when he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings. Then he added, behold, I have come to do your will. The author says very plainly here that he does away with the first in order to establish the second. And by that, we will have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. Once for all. Forgiveness for all. Now, that's the pledge. That's what God is up to. That's the covenant. That's the promise. That's the aim. That's the ambition. That's the purpose that God is up to in this. Jesus Christ's sacrifice once for all, not a repetitive reminder of sin, just a permanent place of knowing that sin has been dealt with once and for all by Jesus Christ, not some priest, not some mumbo jumbo in a religious system, but in the relationship of God that he is offering through Jesus Christ. It's a very personal thing. It's a very personal everything. God alone can take away sin. Jesus Christ's sacrifice is God taking away and dealing with sin once and for all. So that you can come willing and able to say, it's time now, Lord, to get your will going in my life and in the world around. Think about that Lord's Prayer that we just got done praying, right? Your will, Lord, on earth as it is in heaven. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is just the angle here, is that in order to, get to that point where your will be done, Lord, we have to wrestle first with the forgiveness that we need in order to get our will done. See, we can't go out and do God's will in the world without our awareness of our own need for forgiveness and everybody's need for forgiveness, and how forgiveness is setting the whole stage that God is after here. And so go back several verses when the author, kind of laughingly said, hey, you see any perfect people coming away out of the sacrificial system? Well, let's think about what is God's idea of perfectionism. What is the perfectionist God? What is his model of perfectionism? Well, his model of perfectionism is forgiveness. Think about that. God's perfectionism begins with forgiveness that comes in Jesus Christ. And then after forgiveness, come and do the will of God. This is God's idea of perfectionism, the package of forgiveness and doing his will. It's a relational thing. It's having a good vibe relationship with God that is confident in the forgiveness that he gives us, restoring us, setting us up so that we are now ready and willing to do his will with confidence and gladness and joy, all of that kind of stuff, to really start making a mark in this world by, being godly. Yeah, that's the goal. But we live in a world that's also pretty hopped up on perfectionism. And I don't know about you, but I feel like I live in a world that is increasingly focused on its own ideas of perfection and its own ideas of perfection. First up and foremost, I don't see forgiveness in. I think you can forget about forgiveness when it comes to the world around you's point of view on perfectionism. I hear a lot today out of the news, out of people writing, the things that people say, that they expect perfection. They expect perfection, maybe like God expects perfection. But the fact is that the world's perfection does not include forgiveness. And that is a tragedy, just rolling itself out, because there's a cruelty behind it. The world's idea of perfection is also about the world's will, people's wills. And it's actually a constant battle of wills that this world is all about. And then in this battle of wills, we see people getting trampled, people getting hurt, people getting abused and used and discarded. Even people sometimes who are trying to do well are discarded because, the world has decided on its own version of its own will. And all in the name of feeling better about ourselves. So human beings left on their own will try to feel better about themselves by being better than somebody else. This is not God's will. This is not God's perfectionism. God's perfectionism begins with understanding we are far from perfect and we need forgiven. And once forgiven, we now have the possibility of getting out there positively and doing God's will. And it's just that simple. So I want to end on this note, and that is that, Psalm 40 was quoted. And so the reading of Psalm 40 is really what the author has in mind if you really want to understand what a good picture of a human being's life is like under the will of God and under the perfectionism of God. And so Psalm 40 starts off by just simply saying, I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of my out of the miry bog and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. So here, the picture is one of finding relief and tranquility with God in a world that honestly is going to be quite abusive in so many ways. It's a very broken world. God makes that point, over and over again. It's a broken world, and God is not expecting us to make this world perfect. He knows we can't. But what we need is to find relief, and God is always there to bring us relief, to restore our soul, to bring us up. And so then the author, Psalm 40 goes on, blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after lies. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and thoughts towards us. None can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they can't be all told. Again, the idea here is that God doesn't make a perfect life for you. He doesn't make a perfect life for anybody, but you can have a perfect life when you start focusing on God, meaning that you can feel secure, you can feel good about yourself despite the world circumstances that are going on. You can still feel great about yourself. And then our part that we looked at already, that it's not about sacrifices, it's about the person. It's about a relationship that God is after. And it's about being able to get together with other people and talk about the relief that we all share in knowing Christ and knowing God. Of course, here in Psalm 40, Christ is not the center of attention like he is in the New Testament, but it is God who is the center of attention, just like Christ is God who is the center of attention. And it's all about making human beings feel their God-given sense of worth. And then the author ends the psalm, and I'll leave the rest to your reading, but ends by saying, may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation say continually, great is the Lord. As for me, I'm poor and I'm needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God. You see, the wonderful news that Jesus Christ and God all along in the Bible bring us is that God is thoughtful when it comes to us. He thinks for us. He thinks about us. He thinks with us. He is there for us, and he is lifting us up. And in a world full of trouble, we have to have something that brings us joy and lifts our soul. That is exactly what God is promising here. And ultimately, God says, hang in there, wait patiently for me. I will come. I will clean up this mess once and for all. There is a time coming when I will clean up the mess once and for all. And the author also mentions what it's like to show up in the congregation. Maybe we'll call that church. And what it's like to show up in the congregation is to show up in this atmosphere of steadfast love and faithfulness. It's to show up in a crowd that shares that same heartfelt, love, is growing together, is growing, period, in the ways of God, is not ashamed or not embarrassed to talk about God, to, put their own neck out on the line to help someone else get close to God. And so this is the idea of the congregation. This is the idea of the church, where people can gather knowing that their iniquities have been solved by the sacrifice once for all that sanctifies us in Jesus Christ our Lord. All right, well, we're going to end right there. Get busy, read Psalm 40 on a regular basis, and join in. Gather together with others. Have a drink with others. Talk about God's goodness like we've done just right here. Spread the message. Get together with other people. Talk about the good things of God. Lift people up. Don't tear them down. That's the way the world operates, not God. And be forgiving. That's the way God operates. So that's the way we should operate too. All right, we'll catch you next time.